Sigmar, Cain, Sotek, Hashut, Nurgle, Ashuran, Usirian, Grugni. Across the world, there exist powerful entities known to mortals as gods. These mysterious beings possess the ability to shape reality itself, whether that be in the form of controlling the weather, empowering their devoted followers, or unleashing horrific plagues. Each deity can raise up mighty champions to enact their will, competing against one another in an endless quest to dominate all of reality across this world and in the mind-bending dimension known as the Realm of Chaos, or the Ether. Understanding the gods and the laws that govern their existence is key to discovering the truths behind this world. But where to begin on such a complex topic? How does one approach the purview of the divine? By starting with the source of their power, the very thing that gives them life and sentience: mortals. We'll return to the gods themselves later, as one must first understand the fundamental building blocks that comprise mortal beings. For mortals are the ambrosia, the sustenance, that all gods, no matter how great or terrible, rely upon in order to exist. Despite what the worshippers of Khorne or Cain may claim, it is neither blood nor skulls that empower the divine, but instead the soul. Just what is the soul, however? That will be the focus of this particular video, as the subject is a rather nuanced one. Nearly every civilized race across the Warhammer world has attempted to analyze the truth behind what we call the soul, breaking the concept down into various fragments. Among the priests and scholars of the Empire, they tend to pull from the teachings of Sigmar's priesthood, who speak of the anima and animus, the identity and energy of the soul. These beliefs have been further expanded upon by the magisters of the colleges of magic, who posit that the animus is fundamentally the same metaphysical stuff that makes up the spirit realm or ether. Therefore, the soul, or essence of a living conscious being, is the fusion of this raw energy and the mortal identity or awareness that gives it structure within a body. This rather narrow interpretation is disputed by the verbose codices of the Magisterium Chaotica, which describes the soul as a triad: Queos, being spirit energy or raw magic; Theos, the unconscious and non-sentient inner being; Deus, being a kind of spirit consciousness, immaterial and yet an intermediary between the inner realms of the mind and the outer realms of the physical world. This system essentially adds the concept of an unthinking, deeper part of the mind, which utilizes the senses or consciousness of mortals to interact with and impose its will or perception onto the potential energy of the ether. However, both of these systems used to explore the nature of the soul are fairly new concepts, having been penned by humans within the last few hundred years, when there are obviously cultures and civilizations extending far beyond that. While the Slann of Lustria have left no records that we have yet been able to decipher on the subject, the teachings of the elves have heavily influenced, if not directly informed, those beliefs we've just discussed. However, there is one civilization who understood the nature of the soul better than any other. As while they may not have been as intimately connected to magic and the nature of the ether itself as the elves, they were utterly obsessed with understanding the nature of death, and therefore, the soul. I, of course, am speaking of the Nehekharans, one of the greatest nations of men to have ever existed upon the world, Save perhaps for Grand Cathay in the Far East, the kingdom of Nehekhara was fully focused upon their desire to defeat the very concept of death. This originated from the bitter demands of the first and mightiest of the priest kings of Khemri, Setra the Imperishable, who created the mortuary cult so that the priests might discover how to grant him true immortality. For centuries, the priests of Nehekhara pursued this goal, eventually discovering the deepest truths about the nature of the soul. The following will allow us to understand the findings of the mortuary cult, notably the truths or concepts discovered by the likes of Grand Hierophant Katep. This excerpt thankfully exists thanks to the effort of Manfred von Karstein, who penned down many of the truths relating to mortality, death, and the nature of the soul in his masterwork, known as the Liber Necris.
The Lich Priests wrote that every intelligent and self-aware mortal being is composed of 7 separate, though related elements, being Ka, the physical or mortal shell, the body, a corpse, Ka, ego, reason, and abstract thought, Ba, the subconscious self and emotion, Ab, the conscience or the awareness what is right and wrong. Ab was also thought to be the freedom of choice and the ability to choose between what is right and wrong. Sahem, life force itself, power, soul fire, or etheric energy. Ren, one's true nature, the name specific to every individual being. Ren could perhaps be described as the notion or idea of a particular individual, the signifier of self and individuality. In a sense, the Ren of an individual is not generated purely from the individual itself, but the universe's experience and perception of that individual. It is a difficult concept, but suffice to say that the Nehekharans believed that to destroy the Ren of a being was to destroy that being's memory after death, and thereby undo all that the individual did in his or her life. Chaibit, the shadow. The Nehekharans believed that the shadow was the natural result of physical existence and was proof of mortality. So anything with a shadow could be destroyed or at the very least altered by time and its passage. So the soul, as defined by the Lich Priests of Nehekhara, was called the Ahu, and it was the immortal, incorporeal person that was a blend of the Ka, Ab, Ben, and Sahem bound together and unified for all eternity in an afterlife. Since the time of Setra, the priests of what became the mortuary cult knew that the Ahu did not necessarily stay whole and safe after death, as many were the gods and demons that would seek to consume elements of it, or even the entirety of it. So it was that the Lich Priests spent all their efforts into finding a way to bind the Ahu to the mortal shell, or Kha, so that it would not disperse or be consumed after death. The problem that they conceived with this was that the mortal shell of all once living creatures eventually decays, and though preserving spells and alchemical compounds could be applied to a corpse to slow its decay, nothing could truly stop the march of time entirely. This was unsatisfactory, in that the Lich Priests had for centuries promised the kings of Nehekhara that they would awaken after death into an incorruptible body with their souls and minds intact. From bound demons or jinn, the Lich Priests found that entities from the realms beyond death, like the demons themselves, often took on corporeal forms when they manifested upon the mortal plane. The bodies could house the entirety of the Ahu, despite the fact that no demon was born upon the mortal plane, and so did not possess a true mortal shell, or Kha. The Lich Priests came to refer to this corporeal body of demons as the Sahu, the opposite of the Kha. They saw it as the incorruptible and divine house of the most active and powerful Ahu, which manifested only when such Ahu were summoned to the mortal plane. Yet the Sahu, so the Lich Priests understood, was ultimately bound to the Aether and could not maintain itself upon the mortal plane for long periods of time without considerable sorcerous effort. As I have previously mentioned, the priests of the mortuary cult had knowledge enough to bind Cetra's soul to his body after death, but at that time they did not have the knowledge or skill to allow Cetra's soul to animate its body, nor prevent the body from decaying. In time, the Lich Priests discovered a means of binding their own souls to their corporeal bodies while maintaining mortal consciousness and the ability to animate their bodies. Yet even this was not enough. They knew that even though they were now beyond natural death, their bodies were cracked and withered like the dried corpses of mummies, and they knew also that they could still be destroyed by other means. Their goal, and Nagash's desire that drove him to become what he did, was to find a way of creating an incorruptible and eternal Sahu that would forever be able to remain upon the mortal plane forever. Yet no Lich Priest ever achieved this until Nagash. Through the might of his willpower, his virtuosity at sculpting magic, and his consumption of huge amounts of warpstone, Nagash managed to create for himself a lasting physical shell. Even if this body were destroyed, it would gradually reform once more, without ever surrendering his soul to the Aether. Nagash cared nothing for how this physical shell looked, just so long as it served his purposes.
From these writings, what we can discern is how the soul is not a singular part of an entity, but rather the entire composite. To have a soul, a being must possess all the qualities identified by the Lich Priests as Aku. Ka, Ba, Ab, Sekhim, Rin, and Kaibit. If any one of these components is missing, the entity cannot truly be said to possess a soul. The various types of undead that one will encounter throughout the Warhammer world no longer have souls, for instance, as they're lacking one or more of these elements. The only exception to this is vampires and the likes of Nagash himself, but that's a topic for another time. The other aspect that's important to note within this discussion is just how important Ka, or the mortal shell, is to the soul. As without a body, the Aku cannot remain within the mortal plane for long without quite a bit of magic. And if it departs to the ether, then it will likely start to break down into its composite elements almost immediately, or be devoured by the gods and demons found within. This is why the Lich Priests perfected the art of funerary rites, performing careful rituals that allow the Tomb Kings as we know them to be protected from the predations of the ether. Though, in an unfortunate twist, this may well have led to the weakening of all their gods save Usirian, whose domain served as the home for the souls of the Nehekharan dead. In any event, something that is quite interesting and worth pointing out is how, according to the Lich Priests, the nature of the otherworldly beings known as demons is strikingly similar to that of the soul. Demons, as we know, are fragments of their respective gods, tiny pieces of those divine entities that exist as agents or messengers. The only difference identified between demons and mortals is that where mortals have Ka to contain their souls or physical bodies, the demons instead have Sahu, which are bodies that were created within the ether itself. So while they do successfully contain the soul, so to speak, they do not persist well within the mortal realm. This then begs the question: if demons are merely small fragments of their gods, given everything they need to have a soul, including true names and consciousness, which we know they have, then just what is the difference between what resides within the Sahu and the Ka? What is the difference between a mortal soul and a god? To answer this, we must turn to a different source. One more educated upon the gods themselves than an atheist like Manfred von Karstein. Atheists in the Warhammer world being individuals who refuse to worship the gods for any number of reasons. Manfred's case being that he understands the gods to be pathetic leeches unworthy of his time or respect. Most vampires follow this ideology, but once again, this is something we'll address at a later time. The doomed genius known as Richter Kless shall illuminate us on the differences between mortals and gods in Volume 4 of his insane masterpiece known as the Liber Chaotica. You'll note in the passage I'm about to relay to you that his understanding of the soul itself is less nuanced than that of the Nehekharans, but it still shall suffice for the sake of this discussion. In this excerpt from his text on the nature of the ether and the gods, Kless offers the following.
Every text I have read agrees that when an intelligent being dies, his soul, what I believe to be the interaction of his anima and animus combined, is drawn into the aether. For those beings that were most sensitive to the aether in life, such as magisters or the Asur as a race, there is no separation between their anima and animus. and their souls remain as a conscious and self-determining thing. This is, by all accounts, a mixed blessing, for although it means that there is no true death for such souls, it also means they are likely to fall victim to one of the Aether's many soul predators, and experience the full horror and eternal damnation of being consumed by it. Yet, many of the grimoires I have read state that when the vast majority of mortal beings die, their souls fragment and dissipate, dividing them into the constituent parts of their quintessential energy, anima, and their consciousness, animus. The energy of a mortal soul is then, I believe, reabsorbed into the broiling potential of the Aether, while the animus fragments dissipate even further, so that the separate parts of every thought, memory, and emotion that it had contained within it scatter across the Aether, where they gradually meet and coalesce with other similar or identical thoughts, memories, and emotions from other dissipated souls. Many of these heretic scholars that I have studied insist that only the most deeply rooted and profound ideas and emotional states survive this fragmentation and dissipation, and those that remain are not a true reflection of the personality that they originally came from. This might help explain why the great gods and demons that plague our world seem to be ones of such acute emotions or concepts as love and hate, anger and ecstasy, or justice and vengeance, to name but a few. Because only powerful notions and feelings such as these retain any coherence within the Aether. The etheric entities that are formed from memories and experiences of such persistent, though mundane activities such as housework or farming tend to be very minor spirits in our folklore, creatures that barely have the power and sentience to do more than ensure a good fire in a hearth or help with the curdling of milk. Yet, regardless of a chaos entity's size, each and every one of them is created by the same process of coalescence. A workable, though naturally limited, analogy for this process would be to describe it as the formation and maintenance within the Aether of whirlpools of related emotion and thought. Each of these whirlpools represents a particular aspect of those mortal races whose thoughts and feelings have contributed towards them. The largest and most extensive of these whirlpools are those associated with those concepts and emotions that have the greatest effect on, and are found most commonly within, intelligent mortals. Yet even so, there are undoubtedly smaller whirlpools within the Aether, lesser vortices that spin around the fringes of the greater powers, growing, converging, dividing, and eternally moving like the waters of a deep and turbulent river.
As we can see, there are several connecting threads between the assertions of Richter Kless and the Lich Priests of Nehekhara as transcribed by Manfred von Karstein. To stay within the focus of this video, the core concept is that intelligent beings are comprised of various components that, when bound together, create what is known as the soul, or Aku. These intelligent beings, such as humans like ourselves, then carry these souls within our mortal bodies until the time comes that we die. Upon death, our soul departs our mortal form and begins to fragment into its various parts, unless the individual in question is able to remain intact through some magical means. These fragments will find their end through a myriad of ways, but the most important pieces will be drawn like driftwood in the sea towards certain whirlpools, to borrow Kless's analogy, that are of a similar nature. These whirlpools are the gods, colossal entities within the infinite expanse of the ether who over time have become so bloated that they themselves have become sentient in a sense. So it is that the gods themselves are in truth our creations, manifestations of thoughts, memories, and emotions that intelligent creatures have experienced in their lives, refracted by the ether and distorted as they are broken down into only their most basic and powerful form. This explains much of the difference between gods that we see in modern times, why the four dark brothers of chaos are so powerful compared to any other. They are incredibly basic, core emotions at their most fundamental level: anger, despair, hope, and excess. Emotions that every single intelligent being feels in massive amounts throughout their lifetime, no matter their species or culture, as opposed to more complex gods, such as Ashurin or Ulrich, entities that represent particular ideals and concepts that only certain races or cultures will understand. Humans from the southern realms, such as Istalior or Telea, are not going to be worshipping a brutal god of winter, because they don't have those horrifying dark winters that mortals may offer up prayers to in order to endure these tough times. However, each of these powerful gods are still a core aspect of the cultures which they represent, which results in incredible power, but is paltry in comparison to that of the dark gods. One could say that within each mortal is a fragment of the divine, so to speak. That we are the gods, our souls the basic building blocks that make up their very essence, just as atoms make up our own bodies. Without intelligent life to worship and feed them, the gods will starve. Without us mortals, the gods cannot exist. That is why the gods hunger for souls so dearly, and why any understanding of the divine must begin here. It's beautiful in a sense, is it not? To know that within the afterlife, so to speak, there are powerful beings who desire each and every part of us. Every memory, every trauma, every feeling. Nothing unwanted, nothing unworthy, nothing discarded. Each part of you is in truth divine. Now then, since we understand the nature of the soul and its importance in relation to the gods, we can finally begin this journey in earnest. Well, almost. Please join me next time as we take the first step and meet the eldest of the gods. Though, amusingly enough, they aren't actual gods at all. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you really enjoyed the content we talked about today and are looking forward to more entries in this particular series, Gods and Myths, which is at long last being remastered. I am very excited to continue forward and talk about all of the different gods and godlike entities that exist in Warhammer Fantasy, as there are quite a few. Before we go, I do have a couple of shout outs real quick at the end of this video. Most importantly, I have to thank Drew from Varink Voiceover, who provided the voice of Manfred von Karstein and the mad scholar Richter Kless that was in this video. I think he did an absolutely phenomenal job, and I hope you all agree. He's actually started up a YouTube channel of his own, and I wanted to just draw attention to it. I'll have a link to it somewhere on the screen and down below. I would really appreciate y'all going over to check them out, throw them a sub, a like, and all that jazz, and hopefully we'll be working with Drew again in the future. And of course, I need to thank all of my patrons over on Patreon. Y'all have been keeping me alive, especially over the last couple months, and I cannot express my deep, deep thanks for everything y'all do for me. And I have really been appreciating a lot of the feedback I've been getting from y'all recently. So thank you all again so much for your support. And I do, of course, want to give a special shout out to our highest tier gents, Eric, Sign of the Emperor, Bulwark, Ekardir Thalion, and Hologam. Thank you all so much. Until next time, stay safe out there. Bye, guys.